I love it. Hello all. It's lovely to see you again. I'm delighted to welcome you to the Distance Resistance after a summer break, a chance when the restrictions were down and we were out, and now we're into season 2. And lo and behold, at least in the UK, there's a return of some of our restrictions from a few months ago. Hopefully you have had a little bit of a foresight into what the event is going to be like. I'm going to lead you through it. I should probably introduce myself to you. I'd love to see, who have we got? You've got the chat button, right? So do let us know who's coming from where. And I can see Diego from Bogota. Who else is anyone else dialing in from somewhere interesting? London, of course. You can drop it in the chat and let me know. Come on. One of our speakers is Robert is from Ontario. St Albans, classic, one of my faves. Belgium, Geneva. I just love to do this. It always makes me see like where everyone's turning up from. Not bad. I love it. So a proper global audience, including various parts of Southwest London where I'm based at the moment. Okay, so without further ado, let's get into it and I'll explain what we're doing today. I should probably introduce myself to you and welcome first of all to season 2. Some of you I will know, some of you I don't, but my name is Leo Raymond. I am the global CEO of Grey Consulting, which is a part of the WPP group of companies that you may know. To let you have a quick sense of what it is that we do, we work with clients in marketing and growth and innovation to really provide them with refreshing clarity, to be honest. There's so much confusion and opportunity and complexity around the world today that sometimes all people really need is a bit of clarity and some refreshing perspectives. And I think that's what we really kind of pride ourselves in. We really help people pinpoint where to go next when it comes to growth and how to get there. If you wanted a quick description of what makes us different, we're unique in that we have created a space that sits in between the creative industry on one side and consulting on the other side. We've brought together people from management consulting and innovation consulting and collided them with people from brand and marketing strategy and marketing science to help create a sort of new team of people helping firms grow and develop. And the work we do ranges from building new brands in plant-based food category to helping D2C firms diversify their revenues now, helping brands revitalize their purpose, and a lot of work really in helping leaders and teams upskill their people and help them deal with the world that's coming. So that's why we love to do these events, because we're trying and pushing to find new ways to understand the world around us and then look at what that means from an implications point of view. So enough of the sell of Grey Consulting. For those of you who are new to the Distance Resistance, this is how it works. I'm going to introduce you to our speakers in a moment, 3 awesome speakers that hopefully you haven't come across before, and you'll be excited to hear what they have to tell you. And I'm going to go and get into quite a lot of detailed conversation with them for sort of 10-15 minutes each. And then we normally leave about 15-20 minutes, a bit longer even, depending on how fast we go, for a group Q&A. So I will ask you at that point to put questions in the chat, and then we'll choose some questions. And ideally, you'll come on screen. I'd love to see you. It always makes it more fun. And ask you a question, and then we can get into a discussion from there. I must tell you that we are recording this. We put it up on our YouTube channel, and you can find the archive of previous conversations there. And also it's a chance for us to share it with other people who can't make it. Whatever time I choose, whether it's afternoon or late morning US or later in the evening, someone is being disenfranchised because their kids are there or their homework is there or whatever they've got to do. So anyway, we're trying this earlier time. Let me know what you think of it. I guess you came, so it can't be too bad. And thank you as ever to the awesome Nick Bennett from Hyper Island, who's top left on my screen, who supports us each time that we do this. Hyper Island are a digital training, a digital school really that helps create new learning experiences for people online. So I'm sure you've heard of them, but we love doing stuff together. And I'm very reliant on Nick to keep us all safe and going along nicely without any inappropriate streaming of content. Right, tonight's theme is Phoenix Rising. And we chose that really, and it was from my colleague Sebastian, who's somewhere on this call, because we really wanted to understand, we knew and we could see that the lives of our cities is completely changing. If you've been into the office at all or into your normal workplace, if it was in the center of town in the last 6 months, you will have been struck by the dusty emptiness of that space and how strange that is. And meanwhile, there's real evidence of, in the suburbs of cities, how busy and lively they are. I've seen that in my local area, places that used to be really quiet during the day are now really busy. So there's some kind of thing changing, of course there is. And what we're really interested to understand is how deep are those changes? How persistent are those changes? And what do they mean? What do they mean for you? What do they mean for the business that you run? What do they mean for our lives as citizens in cities? So to help us understand that, we brought people together, three people together from very different backgrounds. Our first speaker is Dr. Robert Muggah, who is, well, I saw Robert's speech on a TED video, and I was super inspired, and I was delighted that he accepted to come and speak to us today. Robert is the research director of the Igarape Institute, I hope I pronounced that right, and a principal of the SecDev group. He's also a professor at the International Relations faculty of the Catholic University in Rio de Janeiro. I've seen him writing a lot. He wrote a piece, I think you got a piece in the Guardian newspaper in the UK just this weekend as well, which you can talk about in a minute. Previously, he has been a research director of the Small Arms Survey, and he advises the OECD, the UN, and the World Bank. So a proper heavyweight and very, very intelligent speaker, as you will soon find out. And much more than that, a charismatic and fun person to hang out with. So we'll enjoy that. Emma Griffin is a campaigner, a writer, a journalist, and we'll talk a bit more with Emma in a minute about what mission she is on. But really, she has been thinking about how you change transportation in cities. You can't really think about the future of a city without thinking about transportation and the impact on our environment. Emma is the co-founder of Footways in London and part of a bunch of other organisations around the UK, creating a network of walking routes and safe streets to get people walking more and further every day. And she's involved in cycling as well and so on. And finally, and certainly not least, Kirsty Sadler. Kirsty is a brand strategist. That's how I met her. She's a marketer and an advocate for impact-based strategies in business. Her current role is as community and sustainability director at a very natural fast food chain, which is international, but I think it began in the UK. We can talk about that later, called Leon. Excellent, excellent food. I advise you to go there as much as possible. She's also an advisor to New Foundation Farms. So you can imagine Kirsty has been dealing with the sharp end of changing habits of behavior. So I'm delighted to have Kirsty on today as well. Okay, if everyone's happy with that, I'm fairly much thinking we're probably all right. I'm going to open up the chat. Then let's get going. Yeah? Ready to go? I love the way the floor's so, it's really hard to get the floor to react. Like in a room, you could get your eyes, you'd be waving. I could see you looking at your phone, getting bored. In this world, it's a bit more difficult. Anyway, we'll give it a go. So Robert, are you ready? Are you up?
Sure, let's do it.
I got you, perfect. So I'm gonna make so I can see you. So Robert, thank you for joining us today. All the way from, it sounds like it's quite cold in Ontario right now. It's getting wintry, right?
Yeah, chilly Ottawa. So our brief but glorious fall has come to a spectacular end.
As it will, and we're going to be enjoying the winter and fall slightly more inside the home than we might have otherwise done in previous years. But I'm actually going out this evening in London apparently for an outdoor drink and dinner. It's really raining here. I'm not sure what I put myself in for. So Robert, tell me a little bit about yourself, and I guess the first question would be, what gets you really excited by the work that you do?
Well, first of all, thanks for the invitation, Leo, and great to see everybody on yet another Zoom call. And thanks also for that rather generous photo that you circulated of me. I think I was about 15 years old, so I clearly haven't aged as gracefully as I'd like to. So I'm Rob. As you said, I founded a couple of think tanks as well as technology companies. I run a digital risk consultancy. I guess I describe myself as a kind of civic entrepreneur / unreconstructed academic, because I am also a fellow at Princeton and University in Geneva and a few other places. I suppose my mission, if you were to ask me that, or what gets me excited, is really to give cities a kind of global platform to engage our biggest challenges. That's really, I mean, I've got a lot of interests. I'm pretty eclectic and promiscuous in kind of what I work on, but that really is what I think is driving me right now. And the reason for that is because I think cities, big and medium and small, so not just the mega cities, not just the global cities, but cities of all stripes and their peripheries are really, really key to solving the big existential problems that we're facing. And I really honestly believe that. And I believe that for a couple of reasons. First of all, because I think cities are super innovative and creative. and I've said before, and I'll say again, cities are always where the future happens first. But even more important than that, I think cities are really pragmatic and they're problem solving and they deal with really hyper local challenges and they get stuff done because they have to, you know? So there's an immediacy to them, which I'm excited by. Having spent many, many years in diplomacy and working with, you know, national authorities, it's really quite exciting to see that can-do spirit you see in cities. So I've spent a lot of my time in the last couple of decades trying to amplify what you might describe as sort of city power. In 2016, I helped set up something called the Global Parliament of Mayors, which is a network of city leaders from around the world, mayors obviously, who are energized by trying to gain, you know, sit at the table of decision making. I work with big city networks like the C40, Metropolis, the Global Resilient Cities Network, the Mayor's Migration Council. There are dozens of them, the World Economic Forum and UN Habitat. And then I design digital platforms and data-driven platforms like big data visualizations or predictive analytics or you know, funky tools to help cities think about what the problems are and what other cities' problems are, but also interventions to solve them. Because a lot of the challenges are solvable when you start looking at how they're distributed spatially and temporally and across, you know, on a map, for example. So I'm pretty bullish about cities globally, even despite all the big challenges ahead, especially at a time when our nation states are stepping backwards. I think cities are really where it's at. They're stepping forward.
It's interesting. There's been a standoff in the UK this last week. This is I doubt it's made the international news, but one very large city, Manchester, fighting the government about the level of support around COVID restrictions they want to impose. So maybe that's evidence of it. And is that, in historical terms, is the kind of the power of cities now and the fact that they might be driving the way our lives evolve going forward, is that something which is much more marked now, or has it been going on for decades and decades and centuries? Like how new is it?
These tensions, you mean between federal and local authorities,
or the reliance on the city as the driver of how our lives will evolve and change?
I think if you think about cities, they've been around a long time, right? I mean, they're really quite extraordinary innovations in social engineering when you think about it. There is some dispute over when the first city emerged. I mean, you could talk 10, 15,000 years ago is what we think. No one knows exactly when. There's a big debate happening amongst city enthusiasts about, you know, which was the first city. We think it was probably in Mesopotamia somewhere, possibly Iraq. But, you know, the bottom line is that for most of our existence as human beings, for the 250,000 years or so that Homo sapiens have been on this planet, we've only really been consolidating in cities in like a tiny percentage of that, maybe in the last 1% of our existence here, even less. And what you've seen over time is that cities began very, very small. They've obviously grown in size. I think the first city that hit about 1 million people was Rome. And that didn't happen for another 2,000 years when London and Tokyo and New York, you know, came in the middle of the 20th century. Today, you've got about 40 mega cities, but you've got tens of thousands of smaller, medium-sized cities that are all making a go with this idea of clustering people together and creating centers of innovation, of productivity, of commerce, and exchange. I would say that cities over time, look, it's not been a clear, happy route the whole way. I mean, there's been ups and downs with cities over history. You know, cities used to be a place where people would defend themselves against the hinterland, given walls and gates. Over time, cities became these dens of vice and slum challenges and poverty. And really the last 50, 60, 70 years, you've seen cities become these centers of unparalleled commerce and innovation. I mean, most patents are coming out of cities. Most GDP is generated in cities. People live longer, healthier, wealthier lives in cities. So I don't want to say that it's been smooth sailing, but the speed at which cities are growing right now is something we've never seen before. So if you think about like the 17th century with the Treaty of Westphalia, which I'm sure a lot of people here have heard about, that was really the birth of the nation state system in the 1640s. At that time, less than 1% of the world lived in the city. And today, you all know it's about 55%. And that growth of urban life has really only happened in the last 100 years in a way, in terms of intensification of urbanization. And it's going to continue. It's baked in. In the next 20, 30 years, you're going to have 75% of the world living in a city. That's not going to change. COVID won't change that. And pandemics have been one of the great challenges for cities. COVID is hardly the first. I mean, if you think about the bubonic plague in the 14th century, if you think about malaria and cholera outbreaks, London's a classic case in the 19th century. If you think about typhoid and polio and flu in the last century, What's interesting, though, is that while these have been incredibly devastating, and COVID is clearly an example of this, possibly the most devastating pandemic we've had since the Spanish flu, they've also led to these amazing changes in cities. In the 14th century, what happened was a closing down of a prohibition of squalid urban living. In the 19th century, you had ventilation and sewage systems and better water distribution. In the 20th century, you had the birth of the modernist movement for cities and buildings, with the birth of open space, open concept living, better waste management. And we're seeing this again right now. So I think what's interesting about cities is that they've made a kind of virtue out of these vices, out of these challenges, and they've often bounced back and recovered to build back better than before. It's not just a slogan. I mean, cities are living proof
of doing that. I mean, I'm interested in that feeling of the optimism. I guess I hope you're right about the longer term, the longer term prognosis, and I'm sure it's true. It feels hard to imagine a world where these places we live don't operate. But I suppose at the moment, without that sort of nucleus that's bringing people together in the way that it used to, does that mean that ideas aren't being shared as rapidly as they were? That new things aren't being, because if a city is a place where great things come together and collide and great experiments kind of start to come to fruition, if people aren't going in there, does that mean that's not happening, do you think? Or if it is happening, where might it be happening?
I don't know. I think that like a lot of this depends on how long this pandemic goes on. I think everyone's heard that. Every thinker, every prognosticator says at the beginning of their talk, much depends on when we find the vaccination, how quickly it can get distributed. So I think that some of the changes we're seeing are going to be short term, and some are going to be longer term. And it's hard to say which ones are going to stick. But I am, like you, I'm also dismayed. I live in Rio normally. I happen to be in Ottawa. I was in New York. So I've kind of gone through three very different contexts in which this pandemic's played out. And of course, I'm seeing the hollowing out of our cities, and I'm seeing the move as a lot of the well-heeled go to the suburbs, and downtown core is becoming a little bit more desolate. But what I'm inspired by right now is this unbelievable digital transformation which is happening, which has of course been a huge burden for many of us because it's imposed a whole this Zoom culture, but it's also opened up extraordinary innovation and creativity. I mean, the amount of sharing of ideas, of innovations, of solutions around the kinds of challenges we're facing, and not just health-related challenges, but climate-related challenges, urban mobility challenges, challenges around affordable housing and living and inequality, is really extraordinary. I mean, just take the case of COVID right now, right? Like, there have been thousands of genetic sequences of this virus that have been shared over the last X number of months that we've been enduring it. There's been unbelievable collaboration across business and government to try to ramp up, clinical trials around the vaccine. There's been a bewildering amount written on this and shared in public domain literature and peer-reviewed and non-peer-reviewed literature. And this is happening across multiple languages, facilitated by this digital spine and this incredible onboarding we've seen over the last 10 months. I mean, more onboarding in the last 10 months than we've probably seen in the last decade. So I'm pretty excited. And where I get really excited, look, let me be really clear here. There are huge challenges, right? We haven't begun to feel the economic impacts of this thing as we enter our second and third waves. And there are huge deficits and liabilities and revenue shortfalls that cities are facing right now, especially because knowledge workers are moving out and because businesses are getting shut down. But it's precisely for that reason that I think we're seeing cities talking about having to do more with less right now. And you're seeing mayors and city leaders and entrepreneurs and citizens get together and talk about how one might reimagine the city. And I see those examples all over the UK. Like, I'm working closely with the mayor of Bristol, for example, as one case of this, where he describes every single system in the city being stressed by this pandemic. But it's precisely because of that he's hosting consultations and bringing people in to reflect on how to do more with less, how to come up with co-benefits to interventions right now that don't just deal with this crisis, because COVID is just one crisis of many that we're going to face in the coming years, but to deal with the really, really big ones, like climate change and others that are coming down the pipe.
One of the things that I've seen some people talking about, you hear a lot about smart cities. If you start to look at the theme of cities, that comes up straight away. And you touched a little bit on data and technology earlier. And I think you've probably got a more advanced perspective than many. But you also hear kind of, so there's this idea of the conscious city that kind of reacts to its citizens and kind of is more organic and uses data to understand who needs what, where, and when. But there's also a sort of a counter movement which sort of thinks that that could be a bad and dystopian, it could be a negative thing. So where do you feel on this sort of the upside and the downside of a kind of more tech-enabled city life in the future?
This is where I become an academic and say it kind of depends, but I'll answer. I promise. I've written a little bit on this and thought a bit about it. And wherever I travel, I always make an effort to try to see these so-called smart cities or techno hubs, these innovation cities, to get a handle on them. As you say, there's been a lot of hype over the last, especially the last decade, maybe half decade, around this idea of building these techno smart cities from scratch, which have all sorts of names, right? And I think in many parts of the world, to be really general, there is a sort of fixation on the technology itself, on the sort of new, shiny, automated systems that create this frictionless, seamless, virtual or augmented experience. And there are lots of examples of that, like really almost caricature style examples of that, like Songdo in South Korea, or Eco in Nigeria, or Masdar is a really famous one in the United Arab Emirates, or Neom, which is this extraordinary idea in Saudi Arabia, where basically you'd have these techno digitally connected hubs of automated cars and robotic waste management and wind powered buildings and all the rest. And I don't want to poo-poo the idea, because I think there's a lot of merit in using technology to facilitate a better user experience and to improve the lives of people. But right now there's kind of a war going on, you could say, amongst many other wars. But the pressure between, say, China and some Gulf states in particular to sell this vision of this digital surveillance-based techno future. And I find that a little bit unsettling. But it's very powerful, especially when you throw in AI and advanced machine learning and other kinds of tools that are helping process enormous quantities of data to come up with a way of shaping a city experience that in a way anticipates your every move. So apart from the sort of 1984-esque kind of undertone that I think these things have, what we're finding, and this is really interesting, is that this sort of technocentric vision of the city doesn't often succeed. Why? Because it forgets the most important component, which is us, right? There's a reason why a lot of these cities, while they're marvelous and they're extraordinary innovations, they're empty, or at least they're not filling up nearly as quickly as their developers were hoping they would be.
They lack character, maybe, or
this is the point. This is the point. I think what I would say is we need wise cities, not necessarily smart cities.
That's
and
right.
We need cities that are organic and human-centered. Look, the future is going to be data-driven and technology-enabled. This is 100% certain. It's going to happen. But it doesn't mean that future has to be managed by large vendors, has to be full of the latest product, has to be completely and totally wired. The question is, how do you bring people into that design? What are we designing for? How is it managed? And how do we make sure, and this is a very distinctly Western idea, I suppose, that it's open source, that privacy concerns are taken care of, or at least debated at the very least, that local innovation is celebrated, it's not entirely distributed, and that we don't, as you say, lose that incredible sensation of what makes cities so special, which is the unexpected. The ability to turn around a corner and come across something that you never thought you'd encounter before, something that forces you to reckon with something different, the other. If everything is programmed in and designed in, it takes away, I think, what makes cities special. It takes away the spontaneity, the possibility of an experience that maybe you didn't anticipate, or that the computer didn't anticipate for you.
I love that. Now I'm going to ask you, I'm going to try and combine, I'll let everyone on the group into a little secret. I do send some questions in advance to our speakers, by the way. So I'm going to try and combine two now, sort of. But one of the things that I know that is of interest to you is, and I'm quoting from something you've written, but about maximizing human dignity and the human experience. And you sort of touched on that a little bit, about the humanity that's important in these cities. But I want to crash that into, I'm going to ask you to try and open our minds to something a bit, the most radical perspective on that you can provide. So what I really want to do is kind of, I guess when you're sort of thinking about cities of tomorrow and you're advising people and you've got some vision in mind, I hope, but do you have like a sort of radical sense of what in 2030, what does it mean to have like a dignified human experience in our cities? Can you shape that for us? Can you give us something that can enlighten us about what that would be like?
I mean, what I would say is that there are multiple pathways we can take in our cities. We can have cities that are where we build them for people and they're human-centric design, and in which there's a radical intolerance of inequality, an embracing of green and health-oriented institutions. That's one option. And a small number of cities, I think, are already starting to reimagine their lived spaces, their built spaces in that kind of way. We can have a situation where we stumble along and the status quo prevails, and where it's sort of stop, start, and in a way there isn't a direction. It's sort of more of the same, and perhaps an increasing levels of yawning inequality that we're seeing now resurge within our countries after a period where it was lulling and where poverty deepens. Or we can have cities that literally stumble and fall. And it's really important to understand that 65% of the infrastructure that needs to be built for cities hasn't, in the next 20 years, hasn't been built yet. So we're talking about massive investments that need to be made as we think about the future of our cities. It's not just the old mature cities where we live. It's the cities in Africa and Asia and the Americas that have yet to be built. So there is this option. And I guess the good news in my mind is that we have the power, increasingly as citizens, to help shape and direct that. Like, now is not the time for apathy and cynicism, even though we're all exhausted by calls like this, endless Zoom calls and all of the other obligations that have been piled on us. But now is not the time. It is exactly this moment where I think we have an ability to help shape the future trajectory of our cities. And I don't want to be too naive and overly optimistic here, but what I'm excited by is it is that localism connected to the global sort of pool of ideas that can allow us to come up with those big policy moves, because cities are these incredible test beds of innovation, experimentation. Cities love trialing out ideas. It's their labs. And so I think more and more you're seeing mayors, you're seeing city councils, not all of which are necessarily progressive and forward-looking. Let's be clear, city councils often have sclerotic members within them as well. But you also see entrepreneurship, innovation, and the barriers to entry to that innovation being reduced. Every city has a lab. Every city is using different kinds of apps and new technologies to try to solve local problems. Most cities have participatory, or at least some form of consultative mechanism to engage. So if I'm going to I think the first thing you need a plan. And the plan needs to be updated fairly regularly. It's amazing that, and I've said this before in TED Talks, most cities don't actually have a plan. They may have a master plan that was built 50 years ago or 20 years ago, but there isn't a vision. And you can be a creative city, a happy city, a green city, a health city, but let's have a plan, and let's update that plan pretty regularly. Let's get citizens to engage with what do you want to be? Number two, set some metrics, set some goals, set some outcomes. It's incredible that cities like Medellin or Bogota in Colombia were sometimes once the most violent cities in the world. They set some metrics, and I don't want to oversimplify this, but within 15, 20 years, they've become now some of the safest cities in their countries. So set metrics and set incentives associated with it. The third thing I'd say is, be bold and look over the horizon a bit. My view of the future city are cities that will be pro-health, that have demonstrated shifts in their policy towards contact tracing, preparedness, procurement, public-private partnerships to ensure a constantly prepared health capability, even if broadly health defined is maybe the jurisdiction of a national authority or a state authority. Cities have a role to play around prevention, and you got to get better at that, especially in a world of shortening supply chains. The second thing I'd see for cities is be pro-climate, pro-environment. And I think our other talkers are going to talk about this, but there's been an amazing move towards more bike, pedestrian-friendly cities, towards rethinking carbon-intensive investments and procurement. And these attitudes were shifting around the environment before COVID, right? Like, we were already seeing a kind of beginning of a tipping point in 2019, and I think COVID's accelerated that. And then finally, I think, cities should be digitally empowering. And this is where I think we're going to see some of the most exciting work, because it's already changing how we interact, how we shop, how we go to school, how we access services. It's been unbelievably transformative. And there's some good evidence showing that where cities and countries digitally transformed earlier, they tended to not only reduce infections and fatalities, but they did so at a time of also increasing the potential for recovery economically. So this false binary between the health and the economy, while it's useful in political terms and political rhetoric, there are ways of squaring that circle. And that, I don't want to say there aren't vulnerabilities and new challenges that each of those goals, health, climate, and digital, manifest. But I think we need to start having at least a forward vision, a north, to help structure some of the bigger decisions that are going to happen now and into the future. Because COVID is not the last pandemic that's going to hit us. I can guarantee you that.
Robert, thank you so much. I feel wiser, more educated, and actually slightly uplifted as well as a result of that conversation. So thank you. If you're going to stay in a little bit, and we'll come back with some questions in a little bit. Emma, are you there? I'm going to speak to Emma next. Hi, Emma. So Robert was talking about, the need for and the power that citizens have to step up and engage and kind of help shape a sort of future vision and plan for the city. And I think, you're perfectly placed in a way to give us a bit of a perspective of that, because you've actually been doing it rather than the rest of us just reading about it. I'm being unfair. There might be many urban activists on this call, but my point is, it's not something which everyone has made the time in their lives to do. So I'd love to know a little bit about you, and what is it that gets you excited, and what are you sort of driving towards? Because you're definitely on a mission.
Indeed, I am. So yeah, I'm my background's in journalism and spent years writing about transport and sustainable business. I guess a turning point came actually when my kids were very small, and I did a urban studies master's at UCL, and I focused a lot during that on public space and traffic's impact on public space, and that was a kind of turning point. And then since then, I have devoted my time to kind of campaigning activism for streets for people and kind of rebalancing our streets, which really, I guess, make up the majority of our city's public space. So they serve all the city, all the residents, all the users, and not just the people in cars or the car owners. So I now volunteer with London Living Streets, which is the kind of local campaign group for the charity for everyday walking living streets. But recently I've been working with London, as part of London Living Streets. I'm working with Urban Good and funded by TfL to produce a new walking map called Central London Footways. And this is a dense walking network for London that connects all its key hubs and destinations with great walking routes. But this is, as you say, it's not just a map. This is the kind of campaign for making walking easier, safer, and actually more enjoyable as well. But I'll stop there before I give too much away about it.
Well, and I should mention, I guess, that TfL, for those of you who aren't from the London area, is Transport for London. So it's the urban authority that kind of pays for and manages the questionable quality of London's transport. So I understand that, and I think you've been talking a little bit about when we spoke before this call. We talked a little bit about, there's. Tell me a bit about some of the sort of upsides, and maybe even some of the hidden upsides of getting out of the car and getting on your feet or on your bike to get from place to place.
I mean, there's so many. I mean, I'll be here forever. I'm going to have to go through this really fast. I mean, it's when you list them all, it seems like just so obvious why our own energy to get around makes much more sense. I mean, health is a big one, isn't it? I mean, I've been reading a book, Shane and Mara's In Praise of Walking recently, and he kind of talks about walking being a superpower, essentially, because I mean, it solves everything, or not solves, or goes a long way to treating everything from heart disease to cholesterol, blood pressure, dementia, obesity, diabetes. It helps us digest food. I think it even builds new cells in the hippocampus. It kind of builds our brains back, supports our learning, our memory, and it just makes us feel great. I mean, a long walk, you arrive having kind of processed so much and be ready for where you process what you've been through or what you're going towards, gets you thinking properly. And I guess it doesn't cause air pollution, cycling and walking. And cars are currently poisoning our cities. Stunted lung development is a reality for children. And EVs don't solve this. And I guess walking and cycling, etc., doesn't cause carbon emissions. Transport is the biggest emitter of GHG emissions, and road transport is the worst performing sector. And I guess, as we heard just a minute ago, I mean, we've councils around the country are announcing climate emergencies, and really tackling transport is one of the easiest ways to battle with that. And also the other thing is, I guess, more people on foot and bike actually just brings people onto streets. it just creates busier streets, which is great for business. And just for our enjoyment of streets. And I guess there's also road danger. I'm going to have to stop after a while because it goes on for so long. But I mean, the chance of being killed by a cyclist, I think it's about the same as being hit by lightning. But last year in London, I think it's 68 pedestrians were killed by motor vehicles in London in 1 year alone. So it's pretty, that there are so many. So walking and cycling is a benign activity that makes a great deal more sense.
Yeah, and so. I think one of the things that interests me is kind of whether you've noticed or seen a shift in attitudes or probably, I guess, behaviours are more important since or during lockdown restrictions in these cities. I mean, did you? I know, but obviously there were quiet streets where I lived when it was really properly locked down, but that bounced back quite quickly. So what have you observed?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. In lockdown, the walking suddenly is the only option we all had, wasn't it, to get out our houses and do something. And it was our only salvation, really. And people did, I think, suddenly realise the benefits and enjoyments of walking. And that was fantastic. And we also got to see the benefits of streets free of, well, not free, but certainly hugely less cars on the streets, which was great. And people were out cycling. And so I think we are at a turning point now as a result of COVID, but what we do next. Do we carry that on and keep that going, or do we all retreat back in our cars and cause absolute gridlock? And I think this is a real key point now for us to make some kind of big changes to kind of create that long-term healthy future for our cities.
Yeah, and you talked about, I think you mentioned it a bit with electric vehicles, EVs on this call, when we talked as well about, because there's one view of the city that we sort of touched on, which is all, you can imagine it. It's like drones dropping off your Amazon parcel and electric vehicles from Amazon and whatever. I'm not blaming Amazon for everything, but nonetheless, they do drive a lot of traffic, or we drive a lot of traffic through Amazon. Do you think that's a wrong-headed conception of how the city will change? Do you think think about it?
Yeah, I think we've got to stop looking for these kind of grand technological fixes. EVs are not going to be the solution. They're just going to cause all the same problems that cars are currently causing in terms of gridlock, and actually they do cause air pollution, and they're still dangerous. And the drones aren't going to do much. The future is actually in the kind of most basic and easiest forms of transport, walking, cycling, buses. I mean, these all exist. They've existed for ages, and it's probably because these solutions are perhaps so boring that they're not really getting the focus that they need. There's a big problem, isn't it, with walking? It's just a bit pedestrian, and people forget about it. It's always added on at the end. I mean, we've got a walking and cycling commissioner in London now, which is fantastic, and he genuinely is looking at walking. Before that, it was a cycling commissioner. Then walking was added, and it is being added, but very slowly. It does need to remember, because and probably that means that walking doesn't get the attention it deserves, and also doesn't get the money it deserves. And I don't think even councils can really work out what it is they should be spending the money on. What do walkers need? They've got everything they've got. We've got the pavements. What else do they need? This is not a big.
I was going to ask you, because I guess thinking about this through the lens of us as citizens or us as business people that can, invest in communities potentially. What actually? Can you give us one or two of like the really big levers that would get more people, as we say in the UK, off their asses and on their feet and down the road?
Yeah, I mean, I'm afraid to say the first main one really is less cars on the street. I mean, fewer cars just creates a great environment. All the reasons I listed earlier: cleaner air, safer streets. So less traffic is really, really big one, and low traffic neighbourhoods are going in London are really, really important for that, stopping the through traffic. So streets become places again instead of just thoroughfares. And then there's and these are actually quite cost-effective measures that councils can be putting in as well. They do cause a little bit of kickback, but can instantly transform neighbourhoods for walking and cycling. And then there's all the kind of other stuff, the safe crossings. People walking do need safe and easy crossings. Less parking. I mean, our streets are just completely filled with parked, empty cars not being used half the time, and they just don't make a very attractive and welcoming environment. It's a huge waste of space. And then all the other stuff, like kind of wider pavements and just smoother pavements that people get, and then seating and trees and all these things that just that turn streets into habitable places again.
That's interesting. And so do you feel more optimistic or pessimistic then about where this is all going in? And I guess it's city dependent, but in the next 10 years, let's say, how are you feeling about it? In your heart of hearts, how do you feel about this?
You know, in my heart of hearts, I'm feeling really optimistic. At the moment, I live in Hackney and we've got low traffic neighbourhoods going in. A lot of people are quite nervous about the changes that these are creating. And it creates a lot of kickback that, oh my gosh, I can't drive where I want to drive, so everything's going to change and it's all going to be terrible. And so we've got to fight against this. But I think as the changes do go in like this, and this happens in Waltham Forest and an outer London borough near us, once they went in, people did see the change and did enjoy it and did change their habits and started walking and cycling more. And all the research has shown this actually really did happen. So I think it's great to see kind of councils in England being really brave, putting these measures in. And I think people automatically change their behaviours immediately and start doing more and then realise it's great and carry on and it builds on itself. So yeah, I think I am being optimistic. And I think, this is a great opportunity.
So in a way, so you've been doing this for a number of years, right? COVID has been a massive boon in a way to you, right?
Yeah, well, it's been councils have been giving extra measures, extra powers by central government to put experimental traffic orders in. So low traffic neighbourhoods were going in faster than ever before and not on a much bigger scale. And this is great because once you get neighbourhoods all connected with less traffic, walking and cycling over longer distances makes sense. So this is, and I think it gave people a kind of, I think the pause did give people a kind of bit of a jolt and think, oh, you know what, things could be a bit different here. So I think, things are happening faster now than ever. And also, you know, the risk is that if we do retreat back to our cars, things could get a lot worse very quickly in terms of congestion and all the other issues.
Okay, well, maybe we'll come back at the end perhaps to some thinking around the group around, you know, what does it mean for, I guess, people and their jobs and businesses? Because I guess there must be an impact on businesses of a population that walks and cycles a lot more. I guess people will worry about, can they get their parcels delivered? And there's a sort of, you can see like a negative potential perspective on it, but there must be is there not a clever, radical way of making that happen?
So again, I think the solutions are all quite already there and quite dull, really. I mean, deliveries can still come to doors. That doesn't have to change. I think we do need to stop having deliveries to our day every single day. We can, pickup hubs. They already exist, and I think actually a lot of companies that are sending stuff out should be offering delivery to a consolidation, a pickup hub as the kind of primary option. That should be the first thing on the list. And if you really do need something to come to your door, then you select that as the second. At the moment, it's just a little bit too easy, it strikes me, to get
a lot of I think you're right. A lot of stuff that arrives at our place could arrive any day. Not all of it. I see what you mean. That's very simple.
And last mile cargo bikes, I mean, that is, it's easy to set that up, go to consolidation hubs and then do the last deliveries by bikes to people's houses as well. But for businesses, really, it makes sense. I mean, kind of more walking and cycling. If you've got more people walking on a street, there's more people shopping, and every street that has made these improvements instantly sees a boost. If you ask the business improvement districts, which are what kind of look after the public space in London for the businesses, they all want more people walking. They know this means more money for their businesses.
Yeah, amazing. I feel like I'm more justified. I'm going to do more of it as well. I feel inspired to get on with it. So we'll have to talk separately about how I can support your mission more. Kirsty, thank you. Thank you, Emma. Kirsty will come to you now if you're on. Yes, you are.
I think I'm on. I feel I need to be a bit closer.
You've been listening to all of this, Kirsty, and I, one of the reasons I was so keen to get you to speak today is because, of course, you work for a company that's been that has restaurants all around, city and urban environments. So my guess is that, maybe you can tell us about this. It was a bit of a shocker, presumably, when suddenly people changed their footfall patterns, suddenly weren't where they used to be or weren't going past restaurants. So what was it like? What was the impact on someone like Leon or on you?
Yeah, I think the impact for us was largely just, I think, kind of related to our mindset as a business. So there's a reality that we are a kind of low margin business. We classify ourselves as a fast food business for anyone that doesn't really know us. And you're completely dependent on high footfall. So you are absolutely, you are in places where you are relying on lots of people passing your door, lots of kind of casual visits, because, you don't necessarily make an appointment to go buy a burger for a £5. So yeah, it was pretty catastrophic. The decline through March was just obviously fairly drastic. And then there was just a real division on what businesses like ours both were able to do, but then chose to do. And so I think for us at Leon, we decided not to close. We closed a number of our restaurants. We actually have 64 restaurants across the UK. We did close quite a lot of them, but 12 of them we stayed open. And that was because we genuinely felt we had a role to play, both because our restaurants are actually quite near some of the major city hospitals. And this throws up a whole other issue actually around access to food, and particularly in hospitals. But we stayed open and we chose to sell groceries. So we just put our milk out front, we put our porridge out front, we put our bread out front, and we sold it because there are still people who, you know, their housing is in central areas of the city and they had nowhere they could go to buy the basic food they needed. So yeah, that was one of the things that we chose to do.
And did that, which, you know, shows a remarkable flexibility, and I guess lots of firms weren't able to be quite so open-minded and lateral thinking. I mean, was that a major deal to think about, hang on, let's stop putting stuff that's at the back and then start to put stuff out the front? Was it a big shift in the mindset of the company?
I mean, maybe it sounds like it's not, but I suppose from a business point of view, it was a fairly rubbish commercial decision, you know, to stay open, selling something totally different that doesn't have anything like the margin you've built your business on. You know, it probably wasn't like the smartest move. And I think from a kind of customer point of view, no, because what we're really lucky in is, and I never appreciated this around retail until I started working in it, is a lot of our business is about relationships. It is actually about people, and it is actually about the people that you regularly see and you get to know. And that's actually largely, obviously, what our business runs on, is the energy and the activity of our team. So yeah, it was, and I think any business, to be honest, like any food business could have done that. But I think the two things that made us do it were that we were reactive to the people around us in our community that surrounds our different restaurants, but also obviously our broader network, and that was our supply chain. And I think we felt that the most immediate impacts that were felt within our network as a food business was the supply chain. And because it was dramatic, in the UK, 50% of the money that people spend on food, they spend out of the home. As soon as restrictions came in place, I mean, our suppliers were letting their people go but before the end of March. So that felt a way that we could still throw a little bit of a lifeline and have some of our supply lines stay open.
And has that I guess, have you got any sense, as long as you can talk about it openly, but that that ultimately it created a sort of boost the relationship that you have either with your supply chain or local communities or your existing customers, even indeed with your staff? Did it have like an overall uplifting effect at the end of it all? Well, not the end.
I think massively, although I suppose we can't quite quantify it, but I think the sort of the three things that we did was we kept some of the restaurants open and they worked like grocery shops. We also started a campaign called Feed NHS, where we fundraised with companies and with the public. We raised 1.6 million to fund the delivery of meals from different restaurant businesses, actually at cost, but to NHS staff, because it was staggering, the realization of the number of hospitals that have zero food provision for their staff. And these are people, you know, working on critical care wards. And then the third thing we did was set up an e-commerce platform to deliver meals to people's homes. And yeah, I think we did all that we could. We had suppliers we'd never had contact with emailing us. Now, in a positive way, it felt like we were supportive. You know, we had some optimism around us within our business and then beyond. I mean, selfishly, we created an amazing number of contacts that we wouldn't have had otherwise. And I think, yeah, there was just a lot of gratitude from people that we were able to directly help. As well as just, anybody that, like the engagement, for example, in our marketing and our email newsletters and so on, definitely went up. It separated, so we had quite a significant drop off from those subscribers who were working from home, had quieter times, and we're going to start being much more selective about what's coming into their inbox. But for the people that stayed, the level of engagement was huge, which was really positive.
Brilliant. It's a really brilliant sort of leading indicator of something else. And I guess this question is going to sort of, I guess, will feel different now because of what, you know, the lockdown or whatever restrictions are rising again in many parts of our country and I guess around other cities around the world too. Do you think some of the things that you and your colleagues have done will end up sticking and becoming part of a longer term strategy for the business? Do you think that they're here to stay, some of these things, or is it really just a sort of temporary life we're leading?
I definitely think that what we chose to do, well, it just brought into sharper relief what we see as the culture of the business, what we're good at as well, and what we put importance on. So I think a lot of it wasn't new. A lot of it just actually forced us to pull together and focus on kind of what we thought we needed to do. I think in terms of making it stick, I think you've always got a challenge in a commercial organisation, particularly a pressured one like ours, is just whether you can really continue to hold on to the right principles and to your purpose and your mission. And I think, it definitely ebbs and flows kind of in relation to your commercial performance. And I think what we chose to do through COVID is going to make it easier for us to more consistently make our decisions on a number of criteria, not just the shorter term or the commercial criteria.
Yeah, that's good to see that in the round. And one of the things that I'm desperate to try and help everyone on the call kind of learn from your experience, Kirsty, and hopefully you can help us with this, is kind of more broadly, if you're not in the quick service restaurant business, or you're not in fast food, what might be some learnings that we could take into how we all, as business people at least, react to, I guess, persistent changes in consumer habits and so on. Is there some sort of general, and you sort of touched on them, but do you think there are any general principles that others could learn from that?
I think it was probably, how do I say it without it sounding like something you've heard before? I think it was, we were very iterative. We were very responsive to external factors, but yet we behaved in a way that was true to what we were good at and our culture. And we were very iterative. And so, for example, on Feed NHS, we used to have a call at 11 a.m. every day with quite a small, important group of people, people who ran businesses and were kind of quite influential or powerful in their own right. We had no agreement between us on how we were doing it. We just were very clear on what we were trying to achieve. And I think the network effect of that, in terms of everybody just put aside any competitiveness, and everybody just stayed very focused on maintaining a momentum and continuing to try and basically get as many meals as possible to as many NHS staff as possible. And I think for me, probably one of the biggest things, thinking in business terms, is one of the ways we will solve a lot of the challenges we face, be them environmental or social, I think, is just to try and have a clearer view of what your competitive advantage is, because it is much narrower and more specific than I think you believe it to be. And
Tell me more about that. That sounds amazing.
Just because I think it's that thing where, there's this terrible protectionism in our industry about supply chains and who supplies who, and it's so incredibly irritating, because it's like, do you know what, if we could actually just scale the commercial demand for a sustainable type of packaging or a certain ingredient type that has been more, like, for example, chicken, which is a terrifying subject for anybody in my industry to talk about right now. Right. You could really just come together and be honest. You know what, it isn't the chicken itself that is the genuine differentiator. It's what you do with it, how you package it, how you serve it, and the environment in which people might buy that. We will create such greater change so much quicker. And that's something where we've just created these sort of structures that are very limiting, I think, both kind of from a time perspective and a decision-making perspective.
That's interesting. So I've heard, when I was doing some reading around some work in sustainability, I guess people talked about how industries needed to find a way to do pre-competition, i.e. get your act, and you'll know more about this than me, but you get your act together collectively to make big change and then work out, yes, you're right, I think that's what you're saying. There are other ways in which you can make your sort of offer distinctive after that. That's
fine. And I think that's been one of the, go on, sorry.
No, you.
No, and I think that's one of the good things in terms of sort of what's come out of this. I think that there are a lot more forums now that have cropped up around our food system, how to build more resilience into it, and how to try and have more collaboration to identify what sustainable solutions look like. And of course, from a food perspective, that is particularly critical in cities, because the bit that I'm really fascinated about is, I mean, I'm very optimistic about the development of cities, but there are, like Rob said, there's ways it can go. And the negative way, I think, is the continued disconnect from the natural world, where our food comes from, what our food inherently and naturally should look like.
Yeah.
And so I think there are, you know, sort of more forums around how to tackle that problem, and our food production, I think, is a huge opportunity that should come out of this, because we just about were okay on our food supply, be that in supermarkets or from elsewhere. But I mean, it was, you know, it was quite dicey at points.
Yeah, so there's a big sort of I guess, are you excited? Do you feel optimistic then about a sort of a rethink opportunity then for the food industry as a whole? Sound like you are.
Oh, massively, because I think what we're going to do, because I think the whole issue in our food system is it's just become too large and therefore unwieldy. And actually our food is incredibly fragile because it's very processed, and all of our food goes on the most extraordinary long journeys really to reach us. And I think one of the things I found really inspiring, because food was one of the most exciting parts of our day in the extreme lockdown, I think this idea of actually spending time to think about, where's it from? What am I going to do with it? How am I going to eat it? And have I enjoyed it? I think it's definitely helped everybody step back from seeing food as a commoditized thing. And so I think this idea of how we make food not just something that comes from another place, but something that's an integral part of where we live and our neighborhood, maybe our streets, you know, perhaps even our garden or any space we have to share. I think that is, I think that's really exciting.
Yeah, that sounds lovely.
Inherently builds more confidence for people around food, what they do with it and how they cook with it, and then how they eat it.
Kirsty, thank you. I feel that was brilliant. I feel improved. I feel like I've learned something and I feel inspired. And I must get back out in the garden really and get on it, but we haven't quite got our act together on that yet. But at some point we should turn the garden into a small holding, I think. I know we've run over slightly on our interviews. I was just enjoying so much talking to you guys. Hopefully some of the speakers are able to stick around for a little bit and answer one or two questions from the participants in the room. We've still got another 44 people still here. What I'd love to know is if anyone's got a question, can you pop your question into the chat box? And I've got a few otherwise up my sleeve, but I'd love you guys to have a chance to do it. Someone's bound to have one. There's always a chatty person in the group. Yay. Anyone else? We could take that, Diego, but should we do it? Do you want to take this question on, Robert?
Sorry, which one?
Diego, who's in Bogota, I think, is asking, in this Phoenix Rising era, can we think about a city's consciousness? Should we think about it? A city as being conscious, I guess.
That's a fascinating question. Diego comes from a really wonderful city, I should say. I lived in Bogota for a couple of years in the 90s and fell in love with Colombia. So I'm, Tengo a lot of love for Bogota, and a city of quite extraordinary mayors, including the current one, Lopez, who's amazing, but Enrique Peñalosa. I mean, there's a whole tradition in Colombia of really quite amazing city leaders who have inspired their populations by not just looking at, changes to the built environment or specific kinds of services, innovations, or different forms of incentive, but really by playing on culture and psychology and maybe deeper than that, sort of behavioral science, as a way of inspiring people towards change, and have done extraordinary things. And a lot of city leaders around the world are learning, not necessarily from the Singapores and the San Franciscos and the Londons, but are learning from the Bogotas, the Curitibas, and the Cape Towns increasingly. So, I think Diego's hitting a point which is really interesting. And I maybe my response to that would be, what we're seeing in survey after survey in cities around the world are, in spite of all of these incredible challenges and trauma and anxiety and distress and obviously health-related issues, is a sense that many people don't want to go back to the old normal. A sense that something happened in these last 10 months, depending on where you are, could be longer or less, that whether it's because of a turn towards micromobility, whether it's about the shortening of supply chains and a move from just in time to just in case, whether it was about a rethinking of the business model because you had to go remote, whether it was understanding how to think about the nature of education, because suddenly parents are much more involved in many cases, reluctantly so, in education, and of course, learning about a lot of it. Something's happened. And I think, we're seeing it across health, food, mobility, energy, and the rest. And something's happened, I think, just to go back to this issue on the climate front, in the sense that we actually will have moderate, but important reductions in CO2, NO2, and particulate matter as a result of this crisis. There is a danger that there's a snapback, and there's a sort of political moment, an opportunity that we're in right now, and a social opportunity where we could go back to the old normal, where especially in a financial crunch, cities are going to have to make serious decisions around their budgets. New York, for example, has an $8 billion hole in their budget right now. The temptation will be to go back to carbon intensive fuel. The temptation will be to go back to sort of business as usual strategy. And I think we as citizens and as businesses and as advocates and as entrepreneurs need to, I think, make the case for why some things ought not to go back. So this is an opportunity, I think, to think about that alternate possibility. And more than ever, you're going to have to think about leaders and mayors in particular, but not just, who can inspire us to think differently about the risks we face. And I think the final thing I'll say about this is that there's a case to be made here, and I'm looking at you here, Leo, from the marketing perspective, on being able to demonstrate the co-benefits of a lot of these innovations, some of them old, some of them new. And I think the example of biking is a wonderful one, because biking isn't just about less congestion on the road, and it isn't even just about better health. It's about cleaner air, it's about better retail, it's about less crime. I mean, there's so many co-benefits from these kinds of decisions. And so now is a time, I think, for cities to start thinking about not just discrete verticals, but what is the plan? What is, as they say, the culture, the consciousness of this strategy? If it's a 15, 20-minute city or neighborhood, let's do that. If it's about regenerative sharing, circular donut economics, well, let's set that in terms of thinking about our regulation, zoning, and procurement decisions. So I think we've got to get better, we as our collective, at selling the co-benefits and that vision with some pretty tight metrics, being mindful of the huge challenges ahead. Because I don't actually think we have a choice. You know, here's the thing, it's not a nice to have. You know, I honestly believe that our survival will depend on making some pretty important decisions in these moments, in these months and years ahead, that will shape the trajectory of our cities, and not just our mature cities, but the cities that are currently being built. So there is this opportunity space, and it's hard to even imagine having to summon up the energy to do it, given all of these extra pressures that we're facing. But I would say that cities and city leaders are thinking about it right now.
This is the moment. I love the idea of dealing with a snapback and selling a better vision. Thank you, Robert. Any other questions? If not, I've got a question for the guys, but I've talked a lot today. Does anyone else want to ask anything of Robert or Kirsty or Emma? If not, I'm going to ask them. I've got one. Mark Hall. How do we manage to enable those who are less mobile to make different transport choices? Emma, do you want to take point on this? Mark, you could ask your question in person if you like, if Nick can find you. No.
Yes. Oh, hi, Mark.
Yes, I'm here. I'm in a photographic studio at work at the moment. But yes, I mean, some of the issues with I think you touched on it before about the state of pavements and areas where people walk. I think is a big issue for people with mobility issues. Yeah. I mean, recently I just had to help. In fact, yesterday there was somebody on a mobility scooter who just couldn't navigate the pavements because there was no way for her to get her scooter up the pavement, and she couldn't lift it herself. So, I mean, increasingly there are because of the economic situation in the past, some of the infrastructure, the roads, the pavements, the thoroughfares are making it more hostile for people to navigate. So what would we do about that? Would we prioritize public transport for people who are less mobile? I don't know. I'll shut up now.
Yeah, it's a great point. And actually, when we were putting together the map, this Footways network for central London, we were out on the streets devising the work, and it just makes it so apparent actually how much of the street network is not built for people in wheelchairs, and there are so many non-drop curbs or narrow crooked pavements, and it needs so much work to do that. the transport network is getting better in London for people with disabilities, but needs to go a lot further. There is a huge amount of work to be done on this, and for cycling for people with disabilities. I know there's some work in London going on. This is a possibility, but there needs to be much more infrastructure and tools for that to happen. This is a huge focus. If we plan cities for people pushing buggies, we can create cities that are better for everyone. And this is something that we've been trying to do when we've been looking at this, imagining you're pushing a buggy or sometimes pushing a buggy to look at the gaps. Is that enough? I don't know what more I can say, but I thoroughly agree.
Emma, I was going to ask you, and this is maybe, it's not quite to Mark's question, but it is something which might be a nice way to kind of close off our session, if anyone's got a killer final question, which is just, how do I walk more? What is there like a sort of thing I have to think differently or do differently in my daily routine that would be a powerful trigger or change agent?
Well, first of all, I'm going to say pick up our Footways map of central London next time in. You can get, and that will be all the tool you need to get out there. But I think route choice is a great thing. Choose a nice route somewhere you're walking. Get off at the main line station if you're coming into central London and you're going somewhere. Get off at a main line station, do the final stretch walking, or walk a little bit further to get to your tube station. See that, find a way of fitting in a 20-minute walk. That's always a great way to start. And once you build in a 5-minute walk is great, but once you start building in 20 minutes into your day, then you really get the real benefits from it, and you instantly feel fantastic, and then want to make that a habit. And then before you know it, you're walking everywhere, and it's just the way you get around. And we forget actually that walking actually on 20 minutes doesn't actually take much longer than a bus or a taxi.
Yeah. Thank you. That's very helpful. Well, look, I think we're coming close to an hour and 10 since everyone joined, and it's probably time to let you get off and get your lunch if you're in the US, or get your dinner if you're in Europe. I wanted to thank you all so much for coming today. We'll carry on the conversation a little bit on. I'll probably be hosting some of this on LinkedIn, and we'll post the video up and some follow-up notes which I'll mail out to you guys. But I'd love to hear from you. It's always really nice to get messages and questions and suggestions. And we're going to do another one of these at the beginning of December, I think, after Thanksgiving. So I would be delighted if you would come to that. I'd like to thank our speakers today, Kirsty Sadler, who had to run off, Emma Griffin, who did a wonderful and very clear, eloquent story about what we should be doing, and Robert for giving us context and history and vision and adding it all together. So thank you all for coming. It's a delight always to host this. It's a real pleasure, and I would be delighted if you would come again in a month's time. Thank you very much. Thank you to our speakers. Cheers, guys.
Thanks.
Bye.